Hello and welcome everyone to our VistaTech Life Sciences in Focus podcast. Fascinating conversations with global life sciences experts. This is a space where we interview life sciences experts once a month. I'm your host, Karen Kadgett. I'm excited to talk with today's guest, Toban Zolman, someone with a fascinating career history who is currently CEO of Kivo, a unified document management system. So let's dive in. It's a pleasure for me to have you here today, Toban.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Karen.
And please tell us a little bit about your origin story and about Kivo.
Yeah, so I guess my career kind of has a few chapters, and I started out in regulatory. I was an early employee at a company called ISI, Image Solutions, Inc., based out of New Jersey, and we were an early pioneer in electronic submissions. And so I worked really closely at ISI with a lot of very large pharma companies to make the transition from paper to electronic, build global regulatory process, and ultimately support ECTD kind of across their organizations. And while that was incredibly fascinating, ISI got acquired, and I felt like the transition from paper to electronic had been evolutionary, but not revolutionary, and I didn't see a ton of innovation that was really going to happen. And so I left and started a new chapter, and did a whole series of venture-backed enterprise SaaS startups, and had a great deal of fun in very different markets, from life sciences, social, cloud, DevOps, kind of you name it, IoT. And then a few years ago, started taking a look at the life sciences space again, and felt like some really big pendulums had swung from kind of my first lap, so to speak, in regulatory. And the market felt ripe for disruption, if you will. The transition to electronic had happened, and not a whole lot had kind of happened beyond that, kind of as I expected. And a lot of the techniques and best practices that we were using in other markets, I felt like, man, this would just make life so much easier in regulatory. And so Kivo was born out of that, really trying to focus on how to help emerging companies that don't have a product in market, that are, doing their first clinical trials, their first IND with the FDA, how to help them run that business more efficiently and in a compliant way. And so that's kind of what Kivo does.
Yeah, very good. So you left life sciences and then you returned. You mentioned innovation. Is that the story there? What's going on with that?
Yeah, I think so. There were a few things that really piqued my interest, I think, from a market opportunity standpoint, as well as from a technology standpoint, where I felt like those two things kind of were intersecting in a way that was novel, and we could move the needle in a unique way. And so, kind of to, I guess, drill in on that a little bit. On the one hand, from a market standpoint, 70% of clinical trials are now being run by companies that don't have a product in market. I think traditionally the way we saw a lot of that work done was a, tier one pharma company would effectively run the trial or take a promising compound or therapeutic out of an academic institution and facilitate the trial. But there was this, pendulum swing to emerging companies. And so, what does that actually mean? Well, I think what's unique and what changed from when I was in life sciences in the early 2000s to today is a new funding model that kind of supports this. And so venture capital really poured into life sciences in a way that hadn't been there historically. And that really fueled, I think, smaller companies being able to raise venture capital dollars to run clinical trials and get products all the way to market without a tier one company either acquiring the asset or running the trial on their behalf. And so, on average, Kivo's customers have raised over $150 million, but average, I don't know, somewhere less than 100 employees. And so that's a super interesting dynamic where they've got money, they can execute efficiently, but are doing so in a very new way. Decentralized teams, heavy reliance on partners and contractors instead of bringing that all in-house, and really putting all of that money that they've raised to work specifically around the clinical trial and, proving out the safety and efficacy of the drug.
Yeah. So, the decentralized world, the post-COVID world.
Yeah.
So, right. So you have Kivo existed before the pandemic, right? So you've re-architectured it, reimagined it, or brought it up to go ahead.
We did. So I think I describe Kivo as a product, as a post-pandemic product. We took the opportunity really at the tail end of COVID, of the lockdown, of re-architecting the platform really from the ground up. We saw this transformation happening. These companies were already small, nimble, relying on contractors. But what we saw happening was that work was just increasingly moving virtual. So, the very first iterations of the product assumed people were in the same room and you didn't need a ton of workflow because you could, look over your shoulder and ask Biff what was going on with a particular document. And so we really restructured how the product works, how collaboration happens, and leveraged, frankly, a lot of best practices that the rest of the world uses kind of day in and day out when it comes to collaboration tools that just hadn't filtered back into regulatory or even life sciences more broadly. And so, I think with Kivo, you kind of have the best of both worlds, I feel like, in that regard. You have a very modern architecture, globally distributed, high availability, kind of all new collaboration tools, but really built on a both technical and compliance foundation that's been around for over a decade. And so we've seen really rapid adoption of Kivo, both in terms of new customers, but even once we get into an organization, because we span regulatory, clinical, and quality, and we kind of dovetail in so efficiently to these decentralized workflows, the amount of growth we get in customers as more and more employees kind of come onto the platform has been, frankly, way faster than I would have guessed or anticipated. And I think it just speaks to the way in which drugs get developed and teams work together are just fundamentally different now than they were a decade ago or pre-pandemic. I mean, realistically.
Yep. So more broadly, your excursion outside life sciences to adopt best practices in perhaps, may I say, more innovative environments, or let's say less risk-averse environments.
Yes,
is that you're fundamentally what's happening? We should talk about risk and unwillingness or resistance to change in life sciences. Can you speak to that a little? Is that something you observe?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, you even see different risk profiles between groups, whether it's regulatory versus quality, et cetera. And I get it, like fundamentally, no one in a quality organization, especially, ever lost their job for being too risk adverse. I think there is there's a necessary element there, and one that makes kind of the foundation of drug development generally a safe endeavor, especially with regulatory checks and balances that the professionals in this space are genuinely interested in the safety of the products. And compliance is a way to kind of mitigate that risk, so to speak. So we definitely see that, and I think transparently, as a company that's not super well known in the space, that's a hurdle we have to get over in any sort of a sales cycle or engagement with a new customer, and one that I think we don't have much problem with, because there's great ways to demonstrate that and provide evidence of kind of how that risk aversion manifests itself, both in our company's process and the product. But yeah, without a doubt, I think that there's as an industry, there is a bias toward risk aversion. What I think is unique in the low end of the market, and by low end, I mean like, nascent companies without a lot of products approved, is there's this tension that exists there between focusing on safety and risk management and their funding model. And what I mean by that is, a venture capital model really looks to return money invested back to limited partners within 10 years. That's kind of the way that most of these funds are structured. And realistically, they raise a fund. It takes a while to get that fund spun up, get investments made. So you kind of look at a 7-year horizon for a lot of those investments, from the time they get money, put money to work, to when they need to return it to limited partners. And the tension that exists there is, it's 13.6 years right now to go from patent to approval. And so there's really no way that aligns to the venture capital model. And so a lot of what we see in these emerging companies is trying to figure out, okay, we know that landscape is there. How do we move faster while mitigating risk and ensuring safety? And some of that is, we're seeing AI come into the mix here. We're seeing process optimization, which is really where Kivo focuses. But there's also just business model changes of, how can we get to a liquidity event faster? Is it selling the asset? Is it M&A activity? So all of that kind of structures how work gets done and what the finish line is in a unique way that really wasn't there 5-10 years ago. And it's really that kind of tension in the business model.
Yep. And that tension's visible to all of us who are in the space, right? It doesn't take spending much time with people in small biotechs, the kind of company that you're talking about, or even biopharma. Let's not be specific to biologics. It doesn't take much time to feel that tension. And that, what you talked about, the 10-year, the 13.6 years. Yeah. Yet you've succeeded where some seem to have failed in VC with your personal story, at least. So well done on that front. I suppose awareness is part of the battle, the start of winning the battle.
Yeah, for sure.
So having talked about risk aversion and life sciences, and you mentioned AI along the way, AI adds risk. So where do you think we're going to be able to use AI? Where do you think it's going to make us more productive? How do you think, what are your thoughts on AI in life sciences, or specifically in clinical or in software solutions?
Yeah, so great question. And I think the answer to that depends a little bit on your time horizon, right? I think that there are areas where AI can have immediate impact without a ton of risk introduced. I see those in a couple of areas. One is on the drug discovery side, where AI can radically increase the pace at which promising compounds or gene therapies could be used. And the early work that's being done there, I mean, we're talking like 10 to 100x increases in the number of promising items that come through the drug development or drug discovery pipeline. So those can all be identified and then pulled through a very traditional drug development phase, which has all of the same safety and efficacy. But I want to come back to that because I think that introduces a ton of like implications for the industry. But the other area I think is automation. There's work being done by large pharma and software vendors on authoring documents using AI that go to agencies. Obviously, risk there. But outside of that, I think where we see a lot of opportunity for innovation in a very controlled way is everything that really happens in both the clinical trials and in the regulatory process really leverages highly structured content and documents. And if we look at the work that a lot of our customers are doing in managing that, they're running around from person to person. Where's 32P23 and, trying to get documents that map to the TMF reference model identified. We see a lot of opportunity rather than have all of that in the document and in the DMS and in a project tool and in a PowerPoint where you're summarizing all of it, to just stitch that together. And AI is very capable of understanding that this 32P23 document is the same as this one and the same as this one. And Kivo kind of works to stitch all of that together. Right. So we feel like there are ways, especially with these constrained teams with distributed resources, to really leverage that to bring everything closer together, single pane of glass, so to speak, in terms of visibility across all of those projects and drive efficiency there. But if you take a step back kind of at a meta trend, I think the AI in the drug discovery process, I don't think many folks have really conceptualized how big of a shift that's going to be in the industry. So everyone talks about like the increase in clinical trials. It's, basically increased tenfold from 2001, from like 1,800 active clinical trials in the US to now we're at like 20 to 30,000, depending on how you measure it. And it's like 10% compounded annual growth rate on that. But that's all using fairly traditional drug discovery methods. I mean, a little bit of machine learning, but if you increase the pipeline into that by 10 to 100x, I mean, literally everything breaks. The number of items the FDA has to review off the charts. The amount of promising compounds or products that will receive venture funding off the charts. So I just think there's this tsunami coming in terms of dollars pouring into it. I think the last figure I saw was that investment in AI-based drug discovery had crossed $60 billion with a B. There's just no scenario where this much effort and dollars doesn't yield an exponential growth in the amount of products that are promising enough to make it through a clinical trial phase. And there's just, from CROs to drug development companies to everything in between, there just ain't enough people in the industry right now to really process all of that using traditional methods. And so I think that's the knock-on effect of all of this is, paper to electronic, decentralized clinical trials, all of these were evolutions in process, and we're getting ready for a true revolution that's needed, a total paradigm shift in how this work gets done. And that probably has regulatory implications. It for sure has technology and process implications. But I think that the whole landscape and infrastructure of life sciences is about to go through a fundamental shift over the next decade as that rushing wave of new drugs, devices, et cetera, hits the market.
That's hugely insightful. So I'm thinking of picking up on 2 points you made. Well, first, I'm old enough to remember when high throughput screening came in to the labs.
Yeah.
Remember, that
Yeah.
was radical. Like, you're perhaps
Yeah.
a bit younger than me, but the late 90s, I was doing my PhD. It was just this radical, and we couldn't imagine how it was going to transform everything. And of course, now we know how it transformed. So when you talk about the tsunami,
Yeah.
I can see the parallel there. So that was just, you took me back. You took me back there.
Yeah.
So when HTS was scary and radical and new, and content authoring. So I loved what you said about the single pane of glass is what you said, right? And how
Yeah.
I mean, we have such similar content in so very many places, yet authoring. Authoring obviously is close to our heart at Vistatech, right? We author and translate the content involved in the processes that you're describing. And yes, there's a difference between making sure all the pieces of content match across the various systems or in the various places, and actually being sure that the content is exactly what it needs to be for the regulatory or clinical purpose, or whatever the purpose may be. So both of those things struck me as you spoke. But yes, I mean, just think how much pressure the regulatory bodies are under, let's just say in the FDA and the EU already, just with simple changes. I mean, how are they going to handle all this? Where's that radical shift coming from? So you ask good questions. So our time is coming up. Is there anything else you'd like to say to our audience?
Well, we just got back from DIA Annual, and in September on the 17th, we'll be at the RAPS conference. If you're out and about, we'd love to meet you, where we kind of are at all those typical shows. If anyone is, I think, interested in learning more, we talk about a lot of these products, or a lot of these concepts and industry trends, so to speak, both on our website and on LinkedIn. Would love to share and engage with folks on this stuff there.
Thank you so much. And I will join you at RAPS in sunny Southern California in September.
Sounds great.
So thank you again so much, Toban, for your insights. And to our audience, this Life Sciences in Focus podcast is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever, all the leading platforms. And if you prefer to watch it, you can find us on YouTube. Please make sure to tune in again next month for Vistatech Life Sciences in Focus, fascinating conversations with global life sciences experts.